In this video, we're going to do a quick run-through of the vocabulary of genetics. When we studied meiosis, we learned that each diploid cell has homologous pairs with two chromosomes, one that originally came from the mom, one that came from the dad, that carry similar information. You can see on the karyotype up above that these are the same size and carry the same banding pattern. Each homologous chromosome carries a version of the gene. In genetics, we refer to this as an allele. It is one form of the gene that represents a trait and is usually shown as a letter. Most genes have two different types of alleles. The first is referred to as a dominant allele. The dominant allele is always on. It always produces the protein that makes the trait, even if there are other alleles present. The recessive allele, on the other hand, only shows its trait if it's in the presence of other recessive alleles. Otherwise, it is turned off, and we don't know that it's there. These alleles are shown with a letter. Because the dominant allele is always on, we're going to signify this with a capital letter, like a capital D. The recessive allele is sometimes off, so we're going to use a lowercase letter to signify this allele. You'll notice that both the dominant and recessive alleles are using the same letter, D, to signify that they are both coding for the same gene. After fertilization, we have two alleles, one from mom and one from dad, and we refer to this allele combination as a genotype. Because these alleles could be dominant or recessive, and because we get one from mom and one from dad, there will be two letters in the genotypic combination. If the zygote gets two dominant alleles, it will be a homozygous combination. The prefix homo means same, and zygous means in the zygote, which means the same alleles in the zygote. And because these are both dominant, this is called a homozygous dominant genotype. Do you see the second homozygous combination? If the zygote gets two recessive alleles, we call it homozygous recessive. Our last genotypic combination is a big A, little a. We refer to this as a heterozygous combination, hetero meaning mixed in the zygote, and we don't need to have a dominant or recessive afterward because it has one of each. There is a second set of terms that sometimes are used to refer to homozygous and heterozygous combinations. A homozygous combination is sometimes also referred to as a purebred or pure combination. A heterozygous combination may also be referred to as a hybrid combination or as a carrier because the recessive allele is not visible but is carried by the dominant allele. The genotype is a piece of DNA which will make a protein, which will make a trait. The physical trait that comes from the protein is referred to as the phenotype. The phenotype is the physical trait that results from the genotype. Generally, a gene will have two possible phenotypes. If the yellow color is expressed by our dominant allele and our white color is expressed by our recessive allele, the genotypic combination is going to tell us what we're going to see. In the homozygous dominant genotype, we have two dominant alleles. Dominant alleles always show their trait, which means that this is going to be a yellow flower. In the homozygous recessive genotype, we have two recessive alleles, which means that this will result in a white flower. But what happens when you have a heterozygous combination, where you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele? The dominant allele is going to turn off the recessive allele, and when that happens, this will result in a yellow flower. Because a homozygous dominant will be a yellow flower and a heterozygous will be a yellow flower, when you look at a yellow flower, you do not know which of these two genotypes is actually causing that to happen. On the other hand, when you see a white flower, you know for certain that the genotype is a homozygous recessive because that is the only way that you can get a white flower. Genetics is the study of heredity, how genes are passed from one generation to the next. However, scientists needed a better way to predict offspring without actually having to breed the organisms in order to find out what genes got passed down. So scientists developed a tool called a punnett square that organizes and predicts the breedings. A punnett square actually represents meiosis and fertilization. If I have two parents with the genotypes that are shown above, a homozygous dominant and a heterozygous, how do I figure out their possible offspring? Remember that the genotype represents a homologous pair, and in meiosis, these two alleles would split away from one another. We can show this in the punnett square. This homozygous dominant genotype I'm going to say belongs to mom, and these big A's will each separate away from one another and find themselves in separate eggs, which I can show as separate rows in the punnett square. This heterozygous genotype is the father, and again, one big A will be in one sperm and one little a will be in the second sperm. And I can show those as being on the columns of the punnett square. The squares inside the punnett square are actually representing fertilization. So if this sperm fertilizes this egg, we will have a big A, or homozygous dominant combination in the zygote, which is what that square represents. If this sperm actually fertilizes this egg, we get a big A combination in this zygote. If this egg and this sperm get together, then we will have a big A, little a, or heterozygous combination. And if this egg and this sperm get together, we will have a big A, little a zygote combination. So each one of the squares represents the fertilization that would result, and it's very clear to see that both meiosis and fertilization are represented here. All of the vocabulary that we reviewed in this video will be used on a regular basis when solving genetics problems. Using the correct vocabulary helps us to make sure that we are communicating clearly exactly what is going on in each one of the crosses. If any of these vocabulary words are puzzling to you, be sure to ask your teacher for some clarification. Good luck!